Okay, so you've given us quite a bit to dig into today.
Yeah, a lot of interesting material.
We're going to really try and unpack some of the core ideas in Vaclav Smil's How the World Really Works.
A scientist's guide to our past, present, and future.
Yeah, and we're going to look at some of the things that he uh, brings up about how the world actually works.
I think it's really fascinating.
That'll be a really good way for people to get a good grasp of some of these really fundamental concepts about energy, environment, globalization, and risk,
Absolutely.
and even stuff about, future predictions.
Because it really is such a broad book.
Yeah, it is broad. It's like,
Yeah. And we obviously, we only have so much time, and you listening only have so much time.
yeah, we're going to
So,
try to distill this down into the really crucial and the surprising takeaways,
right.
so that you can walk away and not feel overwhelmed, but actually feel like you've learned something and have a new perspective on some of these things.
Yeah, and I think it's really grounded in looking at the long-term trends and historical context, which is what Smil is so good at.
Yeah, and it gives you a really solid base to understand what's going on in the world right now in terms of discussions around, decarbonization and technological progress and all these things.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, right off the bat, Smil kind of tackles this idea of dematerialization,
Hmm.
this notion that as we become more reliant on digital technology and AI and things like this,
Right.
that somehow we're going to need less physical stuff.
Yeah, he really pushes back against that.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that he calls these ideas fantasies fostered by a society where fake news has become common,
That's right.
which is kind of a bold statement to make.
It is, but he has a really strong argument for it.
Yeah, he really highlights that we are still fundamentally dependent on shaped masses of metals and processed minerals.
Yeah, you can't escape that.
Yeah, so, when you're thinking about your smartphone and you're thinking about the internet and you're thinking about all these digital technologies and you're like, oh, this is the future.
Uh-huh.
He's saying like, no, 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 this is all still reliant on this, vast infrastructure of physical things.
It all comes down to physics.
Yeah, exactly. And what about, this idea that we see sometimes of like urban high-rise farms and synthetic food,
Mm.
and that this is going to, eliminate the need for traditional agriculture.
Yeah, he's unbuying it.
He's like not buying it at all.
I mean, at least not anytime soon.
Not anytime soon.
Maybe way off in the future, but
Right. And don't even get him started on terraforming Mars as a kind of escape route for some of the environmental challenges we're facing here on Earth.
yeah, I think his point there is, deal with the problems we have right here, right now. This
Exactly.
is where we live.
Yep. So I think it's interesting for people to consider, even when you're thinking about the digital world and you're thinking about AI and all this stuff, it's all still existing and operating within this physical infrastructure that requires just, vast amounts of raw materials and energy.
Right.
There's no escaping it.
Yeah, there's a physical reality to everything.
Yeah, exactly. And this kind of leads nicely into this topic of getting to net zero by 2050.
Yeah, that ambitious goal.
It's a huge target that we hear all the time, and I think Smil offers a really sobering perspective on whether this is actually achievable in that time frame.
I think it's a question that we need to ask, about the practicality of these timelines.
Yeah.
And Smil really argues that to get to zero emissions by 2050 is only conceivable through either what he calls an unthinkable global economic retreat.
Which nobody wants.
Nope, nobody wants. Or, he says, extraordinarily rapid transformations relying on near miraculous technical advances.
Right. So either we have to stop everything,
Right.
which isn't going to happen,
Which isn't going to happen. Or we need some, magical technology to just appear.
to come and save the day.
Right.
And he makes a really crucial point that right now we lack a convincing, practical, affordable global strategy and technical means to
Right.
pull off this miracle.
Right.
So basically we're saying we want to get to this place, but we don't know how to get there.
Yeah, there's a gap between the aspirations and the reality.
Yeah. And I think he talks about this disconnect between wishful thinking and reality.
Right.
And he really stresses the need for discussions to be grounded in what is physically possible, not just what we hope for.
I think that's such a key takeaway.
Yeah.
And one thing that I found particularly interesting that we should mention is this idea of net zero, because a lot of countries have these targets.
Yeah, Norway wants to get there by 2030, Finland by 2035.
The EU, Canada, Japan, South Africa by 2050, China by 2060.
Everyone's got a target.
Right. But the problem is, as Smil points out, the whole concept of net zero relies heavily on using technology to remove CO2 from the atmosphere on a massive scale.
Right.
And these technologies, as he points out, aren't yet commercially viable at the scale we need.
Right. So we're basically saying, like, yeah, we'll just invent this technology that's going to suck all the CO2 out of the air,
Right.
and it'll be fine.
Exactly. And it's
Yeah.
not that simple.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at where we are making progress, it seems like decarbonizing electricity generation is one area where we're making some strides.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, the cost of solar and wind power has come down dramatically.
Right.
And we're seeing, regions like Germany really increasing the amount of electricity they produce from renewables.
Right.
But the problem, as Smil explains, is that wind and solar power are intermittent.
Yeah.
Which means they're not constantly generating electricity. And when they supply a larger share of your total energy needs, that intermittency becomes a real
Yeah,
challenge.
because the sun's not always shining and the wind's not always blowing.
Exactly. And you either need to be able to import electricity from other regions reliably, or you need to have massive energy storage solutions.
Right.
And those solutions themselves face all sorts of challenges in terms of, materials and technological development.
We're talking batteries the size of cities.
Exactly. We're not there yet.
Yeah, and I think this is where it gets really interesting because Smil points out that even with a massive increase in renewable electricity, we still lack readily available commercial-scale alternatives for powering the production of essential materials like steel,
Right.
ammonia, cement, and plastics.
These are like the material pillars of modern civilization.
We really are.
And right now, they're produced through very energy-intensive processes that are deeply reliant on fossil fuels.
Right.
And to make them with electricity would require entirely new large-scale industrial processes that haven't been developed and deployed yet.
Yeah, so it's not just about like flipping a switch, it's like reinventing entire industries.
Right, exactly.
And he uses Germany as a really great example.
Yeah.
They've made huge progress in their renewable electricity sector. But because of these challenges, the proportion of fossil fuels in their total energy supply has only decreased slightly because they're still so reliant on fossil fuels for transportation and all these industrial processes.
It's not an easy switch to make.
And if we look at the global picture, Smil highlights that global consumption of fossil fuels actually increased in the first 2 decades of the 21st century.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And although the share of fossil fuels in our total energy mix did decline a little, it was a relatively small change, despite massive investments in renewable energy sources.
So we're still very much hooked on fossil fuels.
Right. And I think to really emphasize this, he points out that the world's annual demand for fossil carbon is over 10 billion tons.
That's a huge number.
It's massive, and he puts it into perspective by saying that this is almost 5 times the amount of all the staple grains we harvest to feed everyone each year,
Oh, wow.
and more than double the total amount of water we drink annually.
So just the sheer scale of our reliance on fossil fuels is really mind-boggling.
Yeah, and that sheer volume makes a rapid switch incredibly complex from both an engineering and an economic standpoint.
It really shows the inertia of our current energy system.
Yeah, and this really leads into this fundamental point about the role of energy itself.
Right.
And Smil quotes this physicist, Robert Ayres.
Who said that the economic system is essentially a system for extracting, processing, and transforming energy as resources into energy embodied in products and services.
That's a good way to put it.
It really is. And Smil himself calls energy the only truly universal currency.
I love that quote.
Yeah, it's a powerful way to think about it.
Absolutely nothing happens in our economy or our daily lives without some kind of energy transformation.
Right.
It's really foundational.
Yeah, he mentions the joule, which is the basic unit of energy, but then wisely focuses on helping people understand energy's impact through these historical examples. And I think it's fascinating to see how slowly early energy transitions actually happened.
Yeah, even after James Watt developed his improved steam engine, coal still made up a relatively small portion of the total energy supply by 1850.
Right.
He says the world at 1850 was much more similar to the world of 1600 or 1700 than it was to the year 2000.
Which is pretty crazy when you think about it.
It is. Like, that's a long period of relative stability in the types of energy sources we were using.
Yeah, it makes you realize how quickly things have changed in recent times.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you contrast that with the shift that happens by 1900, and even in 2020, where despite all the growth in renewables, fossil fuels are still playing a dominant role in electricity generation.
Yeah.
And then you look at this dramatic increase in per capita useful energy provided by fossil fuels and electricity in countries like the US, Japan, and especially China, between 1950 and 2020.
Right.
I mean, just think about how much our lives have changed in that period.
It's incredible.
And it's all tied to this increase in available energy.
Yeah, he mentions this observation from Howard Odum, who said, all progress is due to special power subsidies, and progress evaporates whenever and wherever they are removed.
It really highlights how fundamental, accessible, and affordable energy is to the way we live today.
Right.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about globalization. It feels like a very recent phenomenon, but Smil actually offers this much broader historical perspective on how interconnected the world has always been.
Right.
And at its core, globalization is really about moving stuff around, goods, people, and information.
Yeah.
And all of that movement requires energy transformations.
Yeah. He says while the truly global extent of globalization is recent, its origins actually go back centuries, even millennia.
Right, like think about the Silk Road.
Exactly.
That was a form of globalization, just much slower and requiring far less energy.
Yeah. The scale is different, but the fundamental idea is the same.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point that he makes that the future of globalization is not inevitable.
Right.
He points to recent trends like trade tensions and the rise of, nationalist sentiment. Reminders that this increasing interconnectedness isn't necessarily a one-way street.
Yeah, it could go in different directions.
Yeah, political shifts, economic factors,
Yeah.
Security concerns. These can all really influence how globalization unfolds in the future.
It's not a given.
Yeah, so for anyone out there who's assuming globalization will just continue to deepen, he's offering a bit of a cautionary note.
Okay, so moving on to something that affects all of us.
Yeah?
Risk.
Risk.
We're constantly bombarded with information about all sorts of potential dangers.
Right.
And Smil argues that we often have a very skewed perception of what's truly risky in our lives.
And I think what's insightful is his attempt to provide a more balanced framework for how we evaluate risk.
Yeah.
He points out that while modern societies have reduced a lot of the dangers that our ancestors faced, new risks emerge.
Right.
And our ability to judge their likelihood and their impact is often flawed.
Yeah, we tend to both underestimate and overestimate different threats.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that he even wants to cut through what he calls diet industry nonsense to get to real options for living longer. And he highlights how we often misjudge the dangers of nuclear energy.
Yeah.
Compared to the very real consequences of burning fossil fuels on air quality.
Which is something that directly affects our health.
Exactly. And the example of terrorist attacks is really relevant.
Yeah.
He explains how the dread associated with such events can dramatically distort our perception of their actual risk.
Right.
Compared to more common, but perhaps less emotionally charged dangers like traffic accidents.
Yeah, we tend to overestimate the likelihood of things that are really scary, even if they're statistically unlikely.
Yeah, and when we're trying to compare different risks, he stresses that we need to consider factors like how much time we're exposed to that risk and the way we measure it, like looking at deaths per 100,000 people versus the risk per hour of doing something.
Yeah, those different measures can give you a very different picture.
And he gives some statistics on leading causes of death in wealthier countries.
Okay.
And cardiovascular disease and cancer are far and away the biggest killers.
Yeah.
Followed by things like falls and transport accidents. And he even notes that when you look at voluntary activities, the riskier the activity, the fewer people tend to do it.
All right, so more people will go skiing, which has a relatively lower risk than, say, base jumping, which carries an extremely high level of danger.
Yeah, and for anyone out there wondering about the threat of terrorism in the U.S. between 1995 and 2017, the average individual risk was actually surprisingly low.
Really?
Yeah, and the same holds true for the average risk of dying from a lot of natural disasters like earthquakes in Japan or hurricanes in the U.S. Although obviously these can have devastating impacts in specific areas, and the risk of being killed by a falling meteorite.
I'm curious about that one.
Extremely low.
I thought so.
You don't have to lose sleep over it.
Good to know.
Yeah, and briefly touching on a slightly different kind of risk.
Okay.
The potential for major solar storms to disrupt our increasingly electronic infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah, scientists would likely give us some warning, but the time to react might be limited, and the consequences could be significant.
Yeah, impacting everything from power grids to communication systems to financial networks.
Yeah, so that's something to keep in mind.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to some big environmental questions.
Okay.
And specifically, how environmental changes might impact the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat.
The essentials.
Yes, the essentials. And what's reassuring, I think, is Smil's explanation that burning fossil fuels doesn't actually pose a significant threat to the overall levels of oxygen in the atmosphere.
Okay.
The sheer scale of photosynthesis on Earth is so vast that it easily replenishes the oxygen we use.
So we can breathe easy.
Yes, you can breathe easy on that front.
When it comes to water, though, the situation is a bit more complex.
Right.
While climate change is likely to make water scarcity worse in some parts of the world, Smil suggests that the way we manage and demand water is likely to be a bigger issue overall.
Okay.
And he points to the United States as a positive example. They've actually managed to reduce the amount of water used per person
Oh, that's good.
through demand management and, improving efficiency. And the general scientific consensus, according to Smil, is that we shouldn't face some kind of unavoidable collapse when it comes to oxygen, water, and food by 2030 or 2050.
Okay.
Provided we implement responsible management strategies.
So no apocalypse on the horizon for those things.
No immediate apocalypse, but he brings back this point that I think is really crucial.
Okay.
Our continued reliance on fossil fuels to support food production is likely to persist for many decades.
Right.
And that's going to continue to drive climate change.
Yeah.
And it's striking that we've understood the basic science of global warming for over 150 years.
Wow.
And we've known about the warming effects of increased CO2 for over a century.
So we've known about this for a long time.
Yeah, and despite all those warnings, we've continued to increase our dependence on fossil fuels.
It makes you wonder, why haven't we acted more decisively?
It really did. Okay, so finally, let's dive into this very murky area of predicting the future.
Yeah.
Smil really advocates for a critical perspective and cautions against getting carried away by overly pessimistic or wildly optimistic visions of what's to come.
Yeah.
And he points out there's no shortage of models or narratives we can create about the future.
Right.
And these all depend on the assumptions we start with.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really find that either extreme catastrophism or, unbridled techno-optimism are particularly helpful.
Yeah, you have to find a balance.
Yeah, and history is full of predictions that never quite panned out.
Oh, yeah. I mean, think about the prediction of complete reliance on nuclear power for electricity.
Right, or the idea that supersonic air travel would become commonplace.
Or the Y2K bug.
Yeah. Everyone thought the world was going to end.
Right, exactly. And Smil cautions us against putting too much faith in complex computer models as well.
Yeah.
Because they often require making a growing number of assumptions, which increases the potential for error.
Right.
He mentions this long-standing debate between, those who believe resources are finite and those who believe that human ingenuity will always find a way.
Right.
And some of the predictions made in the past about things like population growth are just absurd in retrospect.
Oh, yeah. He gives some examples of projects that seemed like good ideas at the time,
Okay.
but turned out to be pretty irrational and unsuccessful.
Like what?
Like trying to develop nuclear-powered airplanes.
Oh, wow.
Or using nuclear explosions to try and extract natural gas.
That doesn't sound safe.
No, it wasn't a good idea.
Okay.
But it's a good reminder that just because we can imagine something doesn't mean it's practical or a good idea.
It's a good point.
And I think what's particularly relevant today is his observation of this current surge in, environmental doomsday scenarios.
Right, with claims of an imminent climate apocalypse.
Yeah.
And very short deadlines for action.
Right.
And then he contrasts that with these, equally extreme techno-optimistic visions.
Right, like AI is going to solve all our problems.
Exactly. Boundless progress through technology.
Right. And he suggests that both of these extremes often lack a grounding in the physical realities that we've been talking about.
Right.
It brings us back to a more grounded perspective by discussing the inertia of large, complex systems, like our energy and industrial infrastructure.
Yeah.
The scale of these operations, they can't be changed overnight.
Right.
And he even gives the example of, the theoretical minimum energy required to produce basic materials like steel and ammonia to illustrate these fundamental limitations.
So there are physical limits to how quickly we can change things.
Exactly. And while there have been rapid shifts in the past, societal and technological, he emphasizes that the scale of those changes was often smaller than the challenge we face today with decarbonizing the entire global economy.
Right.
And it's important to remember that a lot of seemingly new technologies are actually based on scientific discoveries that are decades old.
Right, like innovation builds on what came before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So his message seems to be that the fundamental elements of our lives, our reliance on steel, cement, ammonia, plastics, liquid fuels, for transportation, conventional agriculture,
Right.
these are unlikely to undergo some radical transformation in the next 20 to 30 years.
Even with all the hype around new innovations.
Yeah, and he even uses the example of, AI during the COVID-19 pandemic
Right.
as an example of how hyped technologies can fall short of expectations in real-world situations.
Yeah, it wasn't the game changer that some people thought it would be.
Right. And I think this leads into his final thoughts on the importance of acknowledging our ignorance,
Okay.
the persistence of fundamental needs, and the necessity of humility when looking to the future.
Humility is a good word.
Yeah, I think the pandemic was a powerful reminder of how limited our ability is to predict and control the future,
Yeah.
no matter how advanced we think we are.
It exposed some of our vulnerabilities.
For sure. And I think it also highlighted some misplaced priorities in wealthy nations.
Like what?
Focusing on things like manned spaceflight or personalized medicine while struggling to secure basic necessities like PPE during a global health crisis.
Right?
And he also talks about this human tendency to discount the future,
Uh-huh.
to kind of undervalue future consequences compared to immediate benefits.
Yeah.
And this makes it really difficult to tackle long-term challenges like climate change.
Because the payoffs aren't immediate.
Right. And he mentioned that some economic models suggest that the benefits of climate mitigation efforts started in the early 2020s might not outweigh the costs until around 2080.
Wow, that's a long time to wait.
It is, and it really highlights the challenges of these long-term undertakings.
Yeah.
So Smil concludes by really emphasizing the need to prioritize fundamental measures for addressing global challenges.
Oh,
Ensuring the security of our food, energy, and material supplies with the smallest possible environmental impact,
right.
while also taking a realistic approach to the steps we can take to mitigate global warming.
I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah, so to kind of sum up our deep dive into Vaclav Smil's How the World Really Works,
Uh-huh.
a few themes really stand out.
Okay.
The necessity of grounding our understanding of the world in physical realities and historical context.
Yeah.
The crucial role of energy and material flows in everything we do.
Absolutely.
And the need to be cautious and skeptical when looking at predictions about the future.
Avoiding both the overly gloomy and the naively optimistic extremes.
Right. Our goal was to give you a more informed and nuanced perspective on these incredibly important issues.
Considering the deep historical roots of our current technological and societal structures and thinking about the inertia of these massive systems, what single seemingly radical change do you think would encounter the most significant yet perhaps unseen obstacles in its journey to widespread adoption?
That's a really fascinating question to ponder.
It is.
And we encourage you to reflect on these insights and maybe even explore Vaclav Smil's book for yourself.
It's definitely worth a read.
Understanding these fundamental realities is absolutely essential, I think, for navigating the challenges and opportunities of our time.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.